Hey folks, welcome back to Combo Class. In the past month, I have found literally dozens of 4-leaf clovers, as well as several 5-leaf clovers and beyond. This is the result of a little side quest I've been on the past few weeks, which was far more successful than I ever could have imagined. And throughout the process, I learned a lot of interesting facts about clovers, and I also got faster at finding the special ones, because I learned some tips and techniques that I want to teach you folks. And then if you're ever sitting in a clover field bored someday, you can find your own 4-leaf clover. Now, although I'll be using the common term 4-leaf clover at times during this episode, I should note that it's actually a bit of a misnomer. One clover itself is actually bigger than just one trio of leaflets, and more so, we should say that we are looking for a 4-leaflet leaf on a clover. Clovers like this are in a genus of plant called trifolium, literally named after having 3 leaflets, usually. As you know, once in a rare while, you'll find one with 4 or more leaflets. But what if I told you it's not actually that rare? I mean, it's a little uncommon, but the main reason people think they are so rare is that people really just aren't looking. Now, some people have superstitious beliefs about 4-leaf clovers being lucky, and while I don't believe that finding one would bring you some magical extra luck for later, I do think that if you're the type of person who would feel happy to find a rare plant, that the act of finding a 4-leaf clover itself could be considered lucky. So given that I love numerical anomalies and I love rare plants, I have always wanted to find a 4-leaf clover. However, during all the time I spent as a kid looking for 4-leaf clovers, I think I was looking at the wrong plant. The clover-like plants with especially heart-shaped leaves are not actually clover, but some variety of what's called oxalis. And this version of the oxalis grows all over my area, but there's not much research on how often it has 4-leaf mutations, and from the anecdotal evidence I could find online, it seems like it's less common for these to have 4 leaves compared to actual clovers. Now you gotta be careful because there's a lot of different types of plant in the world, and some of them look a bit like clovers unless you investigate them really closely. There are even some types of plant that look kind of like clovers and always have 4 leaves, so be careful if you find a patch that only has what seems like 4-leaf clovers. Now here's an actual clover flower and some of the little leaflets nearby. And clovers can come in many different shapes and sizes and even colors, but these clover flowers are a good thing to look around for. From what I can tell, this type, the white clover, most frequently makes the 4-leaf ones. From some statistics online, it seems that 1 in every 5,000 to 10,000 of these little clovers has 4 leaves. You have to be careful with these statistics though. They've been done on relatively small sample sizes, and even if we assume they're correct, it's hard to know how to factor in the clumping that 4-leaf clovers do, where both due to the genetic factors and environmental factors. In an area that has 1 4-leaf clover, it's pretty likely that more of them are nearby. Additionally, with some of the studies I found, I'm not positive if they're using clover in the common way to mean a little trio or perhaps quartet of leaflets, or if they mean a clover plant, which is a bit bigger. In any case, if you were in a large clover field and knew the right techniques, I think it's likely that in under an hour you could find one with more than 3 leaves. And I think if you spent a whole day looking, you would almost definitely find 1 or more. Now, scientists don't know all the details about what causes this 4-leaf glitch to occur sometimes, what mix of genetics it might be, and environmental factors, such as having extra fertilizer apparently can help, or having like a chemical spill that makes the dirt just weird in some way. And I've even heard that clovers that are in a spot that gets stepped on more or near some sort of crack or edge or cement can be more common to have that glitch. One tricky part is you might find a lot of clovers along the way that have been bitten by bugs, and that makes it a lot harder to tell their true shape and to distinguish the true leaf anomalies that you're looking for in the mix. And some of these bug-bitten clovers, I noticed, have a really interesting symmetry, as if some bug took really precisely crafted bites that were exactly the same shape. And there's a few reasons that could have occurred, but I think one of the cool mathematical reasons that could explain that is that when clover leaflets are first sprouting from the clover plant, they're in a more folded up form before they sort of sprout outward. And if you took something that was folded up and then you took some sort of interesting shaped bite, you might see some interesting symmetry. Now, although you're looking for an anomaly with the number of leaves, you don't want to be counting each leaf while you're clover hunting. You want to more be looking for shapes and geometric patterns. For example, many clovers have a triangle shape you can see on them, and a four-leaf clover of that sort would sometimes have more of a square shape on it. But with some clovers, those shapes are harder to see, and you want to look more for the stem in the middle of each leaf, where for a typical three-leaf clover, it might look somewhat like that, or sometimes it'll look a little more smushed, but we'll notice that in most cases, the angle between two neighboring leaflets is more than 90 degrees. Whereas on a four-leaf clover, if it's perfectly symmetrical, you'll see a shape sort of like a plus or an X, depending which angle you're looking, or some of them look a bit more smushed, and these involve angles somewhere of 90 degrees or less. So if you see an angle of 90 degrees or less between two neighboring leaflets connected to the same stem, investigate that spot further. Now, a lot of clovers appear to have rotational symmetry, but if you look closer, you'll notice that each trio of leaflets actually has one of them that is the central leaflet, which connects to the stem in a different way and sometimes has a little bit of extra stem separating it from the other two leaflets. So these geometric clues aren't perfect, but they can be helpful. Although clovers can grow in an overlapping way, so you're often going to want to comb your hands through a patch of clovers so that you can see what's attached to each individual stem more clearly and also can see it all from multiple angles. Another tip is to try and get a patch that's somewhat in the shade where it makes it clearer for your eyes to distinguish the different shapes. You don't want it too sunny out. And when I noticed that, it made me wonder if looking for them at night would be extra helpful. But it turns out that at night they do something really interesting. First, let me show you the oxalis. Here's a time-lapse I filmed of the oxalis in my yard closing up for the night. They all fold downward and inward in a really interesting symmetrical looking way. A few years ago, when I first noticed that they do this every night, it blew my mind and surprised me that I'd never noticed it before. And then just this month, my mind was blown again by realizing that the clover has its own nighttime ritual that's different. Here's a time-lapse I filmed of the clovers in my yard, and each clover leaf also does fold itself up as the day turns into night, but unlike the oxalis, it doesn't look symmetrical. One leaflet, which must be the central one I mentioned earlier, stays on top, and the other two fold up underneath it in a specific way. So trying to clover hunt at nighttime didn't work out that easily, but it did reveal this awesome secret nighttime plant ritual I'd never noticed before. Anyway, back to the daytime. Really, one of the biggest tips is that you want to try to find a sort of meditative peacefulness in sitting somewhere and looking at some plants up close, because it's hard to predict whether finding one might take you a few minutes or a few hours. For example, although I ended up finding some special clovers at surprisingly fast rates, when I first began this clover quest recently, I spent several hours looking through clovers in my garden here before having any success. And during that process, there were plenty of false alarms, like clover leaves overlapping in misleading ways, or like this oxalis that does seem to have 3 leaves, but in a really weird formation. And there were also plenty of distractions from my cats, as well as from the squirrels. But I knew that if I spent a little time each day looking for one, I'd probably find one before too long. Well, after a few hours of looking, I found one. And there it was, a tiny little 4-leaflet leaf. So this is the first 4-leaf clover I ever found, right around this spot. And that could have been the end of my clover quest, and this episode could have been a lot shorter. But luckily, I decided to go clover hunting out in the local nature, what I thought was gonna be just one more time. I love taking walks around natural areas near my house, and after I began this clover quest, I scoped out the clover situation in some zones I like to walk through. At first, I just noticed oxalis after oxalis after oxalis, along with seeing a bunch of other cool plants and animals, some of which I might not have noticed if I hadn't been observing the world on a closer scale than usual. Eventually, I did find some patches of clovers in various spots and saved those spots in my head for later. Then I did find that 4-leaf one in my garden, and a few hours after that, I was on a walk and I felt like my clover quest was already pretty complete because I'd found a special one, but since it might be the last day I'd be clover hunting for a while, I decided to take a brief visit by one of those clover patches. And that time I looked around for about 10 or 20 minutes and found another 4-leaf clover. After finding that one, I was pretty sure my clover quest was done, and I actually filmed the original intro of this episode based on that. I'm Domotro, and in this past week, I recently found 2 4-leaf clovers in different locations on the same day. But then I remembered reading about how 4-leaf clovers can clump near each other, and I decided to revisit that spot again to investigate the whole zone more closely. And it turned out those first 2 clovers were just the very beginning of my clover quest. Now, before I show the craziest parts here, let me clarify some things that I expect I'll get comments asking about. First of all, yes, I picked every single cool clover I found. I don't normally pick plants from nature, and I don't want to steal all the luck in my neighborhood, but these were off the trail in areas where there were tons of them, and where I'm pretty sure nobody else is going to be clover hunting anytime before many generations of clover leaflet have passed. Second of all, some of the clover patches I encountered look way different than others, so you should know that clovers do have a ton of variance in how they can look, and I did a ton of research to try to confirm that all of the special ones I found were clovers of some type or another. So let me know if you do think any of them are some other specific lookalike species, but I did spend hours studying clover identification to try to avoid getting anything wrong here. Anyway, after the first day of success, there were several days which each felt more successful than the last. I began to find multiple special clovers each time I visited that general zone, and I began to find corners that were like whole neighborhoods full of mutations, places where one 4-leaf clover could give you a clue that there were probably like a dozen more lurking nearby. One day, I found all of these within a few hours. And then the next day felt even luckier because not only did I find a new patch that had a good proportion of the clovers having more than 3 leaves, but a good proportion of those had more than 4 leaves. For example, here are some of the least bug-bitten 5-leaf clovers I found, and I even found a spot that had a 6-leaf clover clover and a 7-leaf clover. And altogether on that afternoon, I found all of these. So like I said, this tiny little clover that I found here in this garden could have been the end of my clover quest, but oh boy, was it not. I ended up finding about 40 4-leaf clovers. And some of you who are good at estimating amounts may be thinking, that doesn't look like about 40. And yeah, there's actually, oh no. All right, I just had to go on a whole separate type of clover quest, re-looking for a bunch of these in the grass. It took me forever to find this little one I like, and I did lose one. Maybe it'll show up again later, but I was about to say something about how I have 55 clovers here, and we're gonna have to go with 54 now. The reason I said I only found about 40 4-leaf clovers is that over a dozen of these are actually 5-leaf clovers, as well as a 6-leaf clover and a 7-leaf clover. Well, now I'm going to put these back inside some books to flatten them more, but later I'm going to look up if there's better ways I could preserve them long term, and perhaps you'll see them again in the future. In any case, it's going to be hard not to keep looking for clovers as I take walks around nature. I've been finding my eyes are just drawn to the patches now, since I know that they're much more frequent than I originally thought. It's mostly just that people don't look close enough. And when looking close, you can see some fun things, so clover hunting may remain a side hobby of mine, but as far as my main clover quest, I'm going to consider it a massive success and move on to some other things for now. Part of me hopes that this video inspires some of you to try clover hunting yourself sometime, so let me know in a comment if you plan on trying that someday, or if you've been clover hunting before, let me know if you were successful or not. Anyway, thanks for joining me for this little combo class nature break. I hope you enjoyed it and learned some interesting things. Now, while I wrap things up, I want to quickly show these clips from a scene I filmed that didn't end up fitting into the overall arc of the episode. Do not copy this without doing your own research, but here you can see me demonstrating how basically every part of a clover plant and of an oxalis plant are technically edible to some degree. Anyway, that's enough about clovers for now. I'll be back with another episode soon, and if you like my videos, make sure you're also subscribed to my bonus channel in addition to this one, and maybe consider supporting my videos on one of these ways I have listed here. In any case, thank you for joining me in combo class today.